welcome you to AUC, to the very prominent and distinguished Tahrir Dialogue series, where we try to bring issues of primary importance and interest to the Egyptian and Arab community, or to the international community from the region. We also do that when and only when we have prominent speakers to address the issues. And I'm very glad to say that this is the case today. The topic today is very close, frankly, to my heart, and very close, I think, to the heart of the participants. It is the rather difficult and dire situation, both in Lebanon and in Syria. And they tend to not exactly mirror each other, but they tend to have crises almost regularly at the same time. So we've invited two highly distinguished experts from Syria and from Lebanon to present the case from each perspective. One of them is Samir Aita, the president of the Circle of Arab Economists and the former editor-in-chief of Le Monde Diplomatique, the Arabic edition. He is Syrian, born in Damascus. You will be, if you want, you can look at the complete CV on the share, but I'm going to just stop at those points to give enough chance both to Samir and to the other participants to share their knowledge and then exchange. The second speaker will be Minister Nassif Hitti, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lebanon, also a former ambassador, a former Arab League official, and at the same time, a distinguished academic. Nassif will speak mostly about Lebanon, but as I said, there will always be a melange between the two topics. Ramzi Izzeddin is a former Egyptian ambassador, former Assistant Secretary General of the UN and Deputy Envoy for Syria. Ramzi has had a career in Egyptian diplomacy in the multilateral context in Vienna in particular, but also in the bilateral context in Germany and Brazil, and Austria. So he will come in with the regional context and address questions to the two speakers. I will take the prerogative of controlling the mic, and then I will also add questions as I see fit going along after the two discussants make their first presentations. I'm going to ask Samir to start. Samir and Nassif will have 10 to 15 minutes maximum for each one of them to present their case, and then I'll invite Ramzi to address a couple of questions that the speakers can take and decide to answer in a compiled form, not necessarily question by question. And I will also add to those questions. When we finish that round and have a discussion, let's say about 45 minutes into this process, we'll then open up the process for another 40 minutes of questions. Samir, you have the floor.
I will switch to Arabic as we have agreed. مساء الخير معالي الوزير الزملاء الأعزاء.
Good afternoon. Dear colleagues, and good afternoon, Minister. I'd like to thank Tahrir Dialogue for hosting this event and for inviting me to it. I am talking here. Of course, I am known as a Syrian academic and intellectual. However, I'm going to talk about both the Syrian and Lebanese crises and how they are interacting and overlapping. Both countries are going going through severe crisis, severe uncertainty, and these conditions or the events they are going through are resonating actually in both countries. Today is the Independence Day of Lebanon, and I would say that the two countries have chosen different tracks, though their bonds remained deep despite the different perspectives and different crises they went through. And each country goes through certain difficulties, and sometimes they are mirroring one another. The first crisis that is being mirrored in the two countries is the economic crisis. Now the exchange rate in Lebanon has witnessed a new plunge, and this has actually had its ramifications on the Syrian currency, and this is very interesting actually. This is not the first time that we witness a mirroring in the plunge of the exchange rates. During the sanctions on Syria and the plunge in oil prices, the exchange rate in Lebanon also the exchange rate of the Lebanese currency also witnessed a plunge. So this is not the first time we find the economic crisis being mirrored in both countries. And also, if we look at the exports of Lebanon being banned from certain countries, this is also a partial ban on the export of the Syrian products. As for the banks and the private banks in Lebanon, they are tied to private banks in Syria because the founders of these banks actually are the same. And even before the wave or the migration influx, both countries have an imbalance or between the capital and the rest of the country. If we look at the political arena, we would find that the mirroring is less on this in this field. However, both of them are suffering from the fact that there is a political power that overtook the rule in the country and manipulated the constitution and the law. And both countries actually resisted this to the extent of taking up arms as the situation actually is unfolding in Syria. In the the warring factions in Lebanon also have actually manipulated the law and the constitution. In both countries, there is actually a taboo, which is this taboo is criticizing the ruler, and it is of course something that is negatively impacting the country on both countries on all levels. The political authority in both countries are working with the concept of divide to rule. They are fragmenting the country's forces to a great extent in order to be able to rule. And also, these countries both have a problem, which is the corruption and the abortion of any reform attempts. Another thing is that public policy is built or hinges on the concept of exporting the human resources outside to other countries abroad seeking a better life, and when they do that, they send remittances to their families, and these remittances become part of the GDP, or 30% even of the GDP that the country cannot do without. And there is also some sort of convergence in the mindset between Syrians and Lebanese people. One thing also that we can see through the mirror is that in both countries there is deep intervention of other states, especially the Gulf. And we would find that some countries, some or let me say both countries are influenced by some countries from the Gulf, by Iran and by the USA. So this is something that we find in both countries, and that's why their future also hinges on the crises that happen between these intervening forces, maybe between the USA and Iran and the Gulf and Iran. So if we look at this image of both countries, we can pose a number of questions. First, how can we exit the crisis in both countries? Both countries need a new social contract in order to reformulate, rephrase the relationship between the ruling power and the people. And the second thing is that both countries need reconstruction, and by reconstruction here I don't mean building housing units and building institutions. No, we need these countries to undergo political reconstruction, economic reconstruction. The issue here is that the time needed for Lebanon to rise will be long, and this would have its ramifications on Syria. The fourth point is that the both countries need reinstatement of the state, the liberation of the state, dealing with rationality and sensibly with the authorities and in the country, and both countries need to be or to undergo a certain mobilization in order to be able to overcome all these problems. So Lebanon is not the only country that is suffering. I would say that Syria is suffering as well, and both crises are influencing one another. Thank you for this intervention. There are already a number of questions coming in, and I am taking note of questions. However, I would postpone postpone posing these questions until we listen to the Syrian perspective. I won't repeat myself.
Who will deal with many of the same issues and others from the perspective of the Lebanese theater. And as was said, we will then discuss how much overlap, how much repetition, and what needs to be done in each of these two countries, and others, as will be brought in by both Ramzi and myself. Nassif, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nabil. I will try to be brief and to make some, short comments on Lebanon and Lebanese-Syrian relations. First and foremost, the political geography of Lebanon has made it extremely attractive. Not that the Lebanese are not ready and willing so, they are more than willing so, unfortunately, and I will explain, to all kinds of external interventions under different titles, under different names. If you look at our history, all crises in Lebanon could be seen within that context. We're the country that's the least influential in the region in terms of power politics and the most influence in the region. We're extremely vulnerable and we invite all forms of intervention. That's my first remark, our geopolitics. What confirms that is my second remark, is the societal structure of Lebanon. It's very rich, enriching as a mosaic society, as we say, culturally mosaic society, but we're a system based on what we call consociational democracy. But in reality, de facto, it's a federation of sectarian leaders, religious or sectarian leaders. We moved from, al-Ta'ifiyya to al-Mazhabiyya, from, that kind of belonging to a certain religious community to belonging to a certain sect. And in reality, that's the situation that runs the country. An important also matter to look, we have a very strong vertical fragmentation in terms of identities, two extremes. One would consider Lebanon at one point of time as being the Hanoi of revolutions. During the Palestinian revolutions, all fronts were calm, but everybody would use Lebanon to maintain a sort of level of tension and warfare with Israel. Second, opposite to that, we're the Switzerland. We are not concerned. We're not even an Arab country for some people. You would look at these two extremes. Not that all Lebanese are in that. Most of Lebanese are in the middle. But these two extremes tend to neutralize each other and are sources really of maintaining a certain level of tension or inviting all kinds of intervention. Three, most of our conflicts and crises in Lebanon, when we talk about left and right or whatever is, was not about a socioeconomic model in reality. Those who fought in the streets from 58 to crisis of 69 to 75, the ongoing Cold War, real war turning into a Cold War after the Taif Agreement, if I may use this, lot of tension, were based on sort of affiliation with an external pole of attraction, regardless of the name of that pole of attraction. A fourth matter to talk about, Lebanon main function, unfortunately, as I say, has always been like a mailbox, a arena for sending messages for wars by proxy, whether within Lebanon or on the Lebanese-Israeli front, or right now as an extension of the new theater of conflict and confrontation in the region, which is Syria. In all these aspects, Lebanon has been playing this function of mailbox and also of a theater of confrontation. Last but not least in this respect here, on the political aspects, there is a sort of political fatalism, unfortunately, Lebanon, among the political nomenclatura, that we have to wait for our external friend. And once our external friend at this point of time, which could change, our external friend today was our adversary yesterday, could become our adversary, we could spend hours discussing that tomorrow. Once he has, or he will have the upper hand in the region and in the emerging regional configuration of power, then this will translate in me winning the game internally. So there's always this look outside. Or today, even if there is, Nabil, if there is an understanding, an external understanding among key contenders, competitors, countries in the region or groups of countries, the situation in Lebanon, and Samir mentioned that en passant, the situation in Lebanon need really structural reforms. Our financial monetary crisis is a reflection of economic crisis, a model that's not functioning as it should function, which is in turn a reflection of a deep political crisis. We need to revisit the whole system. Samir mentioned the social contract. We need really a social contract. We don't have a social contract in Lebanon, basically. Today, just to mention very, very recent statistics published by ESCWA in September, less than 2 months ago, 74% of Lebanese live by the poverty or below the poverty line. If we add other dimension of measurement of the status, like healthcare or education, we reach 82%. This is dramatic. Now, any Lebanese who could leave is leaving the country. All educated are leaving the country. So the country is really becoming a failed state, like I expected it was a failed state when I resigned. I said it's a failing state turning into a failed state. This is the situation. So we need to revisit the whole situation in Lebanon. And you might in the discussion mention that an external understanding among key power holders directly and indirectly in Lebanon is important, is a sine qua non condition, but is not enough. We need also to revisit the whole political system and review how it is. This consociational model, which is in reality a federation of sectarian leaders, need also to be revisited. On the relations with Syria, the relations has always been a very special relations. Syria is always considered as a domestic political issue in Lebanon. Historical reasons, sociological reasons, political reasons, and economic reasons created this enmeshed, integrated situation among the two countries. And we could see that for many, Syria as an enemy today was a friend yesterday, and Syria as a friend yesterday was an enemy the day before yesterday. These are very important matters to look at. About Syria, just one or two remarks, and then we'll be willing. I always remember when we think about Syria, about the fight in Syria and the fight over Syria, the famous book of the late Patrick Seal, The Struggle for Syria. Actors do change, but the kind of attractiveness, fatalistic attractiveness of Syria geopolitical location remains the same. Where we go from here, there is a need later on, because all the element of potential complementarity, integration between Lebanon and Syria are there. But the political matters and the politicking in particular are doing a lot of harm to this potential relationship. I always look at the missing factor, and I'm sure, gentlemen, you would look at it, particularly Ramzi. The missing key factor and missing key actor is, where is the Arab role in that? Where is the Arab role in that? Allow me to express my frustration here. There is a total absence. There is a dis-Arabization of any attempt at playing a role to move Syria into the Arab fold and to help Syria getting out of the situation, as well as of Lebanon. I will stop here at this. I hope I didn't abuse of my time, and be willing to come back to clarify any point or perhaps make some more comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Nassif. No, you were, like Samir, very much on time. Both of you have really been highlighting a number of issues that I will come back to in a few minutes. But I just want to refer to one of them as a stepping stone into giving the floor to Ramzi. Both of you seem to emphasize the hyper-involvement or influence of foreign powers in the politics, be that of Syria or be that of Lebanon. And the fact that neither of these issues can really be addressed without regional players getting engaged in it. I'll leave the details aside, but I'd like to start by inviting Ramzi to intervene and ask him to try to look at the regional context of all this. How does what's happening in Syria and Lebanon affect the region, and what's necessary from the region to give any potential for progress on either of these two fronts? Ramzi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nabil, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar with two distinguished colleagues, but also friends who are amongst the foremost authorities, of course, on their countries. I will ask basically two questions, one about Syria and Lebanon, and the other about the region as you requested. Now, it's interesting that both Samir and Nassif have presented the case about how organically linked Syria and Lebanon are. It's interesting because also there are important differences. I mean, Syria is a centralized political system with a strong government, and in spite of the war, the government continued to function as a government, of course, much weakened, but still continued to operate quite effectively, even in some aspects and areas outside its control. Maybe Samir can can shed some light on that. And Lebanon, of course, is a country of multiple orientations and views, as Nassif has said, but it has always had a weak government, and sometimes no government at all. But yet, there are very important basic similarities between both countries. Samir emphasized the economic links between both countries, which are very strong, of course. Certainly at the human level and the social level, they're very strong too. But I would like to ask both about the political links. We've always known, as Nassif has said, is that Syria is a domestic player inside Lebanon. Of course, the Syria of today is not the Syria prior to 2011. And there was always ups and downs in that relationship. So my question to both of them, how much influence does Syria have today in Lebanon? We know that there are a number of parliamentarians who are very close to Syria and have influence government policy. Is Syria as influential as it was before or not? And what are the mechanisms available to Syria, in spite of everything, to influence the political situation in Lebanon? Can there be a solution to the political crisis in Lebanon, economic crisis, without Syria playing a role? That's one question. The other question is, the Lebanese elections are coming up in a few months, I believe, by next spring. Will these elections, or the outcome of these elections, in your views, increase or decrease Syrian influence in Lebanon? That is insofar as Syria and Lebanon are concerned. Now, concerning the region, we are seeing today what appears to be the beginnings of a regional realignment. You see a rapprochement between Turkey and on the one side and Egypt and the Gulf on the other. You see a rapprochement, or at least a dialogue, the beginning of a dialogue between the Gulf states and Iran. We are seeing the new Levant, an arrangement that is still in the making. And Samir, you had a very interesting article in Shuruk today, so maybe this is an opportunity for you to present your views on that, between Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq, which has an approach that is somewhat different from the Gulf vis-a-vis Syria. So how do you see this realignment affecting the political process, primarily in Syria, and if it has any influence on Lebanon? Now, I'll get to one point also which concerns specifically Syria, but of course has ramifications for Lebanon. You know, Syria much has been said about how complicated the situation is in Syria. And because it's so complicated, because of all of these foreign interventions, little can be done. The government has not been as responsive as many would have liked in terms of implementing Security Council Resolution 2254. Now, Syria happens to be the one Arab country where there are popular grievances, but also foreign intervention, whether it is Turkish or Iranian. These are physical interventions, regardless of what the context or the pretext, but they are there. And of course, there is the United States, which has a presence, not a big presence, but it is there, and Russia, of course. Now, given that all of these problems exist together, popular grievances, which beckon, of course, to be resolved, a new social contract, as both speakers have said, but also it is where there is encroachment by regional non-Arab powers on an Arab state. Is it feasible to use Syria as a key, because of all of these conditions, to resolve other issues Or should Syria wait until the other issues, whether it's in the Gulf and Iran, or whether it is Turkey and the Arab countries, first resolve their problems and then we come to Syria? So that is my question to you. Is Syria the key, or should it come at the very end? Thank you, Nabil. I think I'll leave it at that, and then there will be many other questions, I'm sure, as we go along.
Thank you, Ramzi. Before I give the floor to Samir and Nassif to respond, although Ramzi put quite a series of questions on the table, let me actually challenge a little bit of what appears to be being said here. I don't think anybody challenges the intrinsic economic relationship between Syria and Lebanon. But I remember, I'll take you back in time a little bit. I remember when the Syrian armed forces went into Lebanon in the 70s. And at the time, the question was put to our foreign minister in Egypt, when would the Syrians leave? And his comment then was, not in my lifetime. And they did not leave until after the Hariri assassination, almost 30 years later. They did not leave in mass, at least. And then, of course, you had the context of the crisis in Syria itself. Is Syria, economics aside, and I know you cannot delink them completely, but is Syria really that influential politically in Lebanon, or is the Lebanese domestic crisis mostly a function of Lebanese issues with a bit of foreign color, of course? I see more players engaged in the Syrian crisis and would have to be required to engage in solving something on Syria than, frankly, in Lebanon, although neither of them will completely be without foreign engagement. But I'm just really not sure that all of this is a foreign element rather than a domestic one. And one last question to Samir. I know the Syrian government has survived, and I know it is providing a minimum of goods and services to the people. A much more difficult situation today than a year or two ago. I understand that. And frankly, I'm very much concerned about the Syrian people and their situation. I'm talking those in Syria over and above, of course, the displaced or the refugees. But I'm curious, Samir, how long can they economically survive with the present breakdown of the economic system in Syria and the application of sanctions by most of the Western countries to Syria? And one last question to Nassif. Lebanon was put forward by as you correctly said, and you very colorfully described it, a melange of balances between different groups of Lebanese. Is that feasible any longer? Is that a viable solution? I'll allow Samir, you want to take the floor first in response?
Thank you so much for so rich questions. It's difficult to answer to all of them, but let me pinpoint some of the things. My friend Nassif talks about Lebanon as a mosaic. Syria is also a mosaic, but nobody talks about that. A mosaic of identities, not only sectarian, but sectarian, regional, cities, and etc. I always make the joke that somebody from Homs will never marry somebody from Hama while the two towns are 40 kilometers away. The second, it is in the fact that Syria has adopted a central, powerful central government, and the Syrians has been keen to accept a powerful central government. But today, with the crisis, with 10 years of war, the state, the the government institutions are weak, very weak. Even before the conflict, we have to separate what is the power system above the government and the state as an institution. Before the crisis, before 2010, the minister was nothing in Syria. He had no real power of governing. Most of the important decisions were made in the palace. Ask Abdullah Dardari why simple things were taken, if even he was thought as being a reformist and etc. on different things. So the fact to have a central government does not change what I have said in the presentation, that there is a problem between the power and the state, posed differently, but which leads to the same results, that the state is not effective in Syria, and especially now after 10 years of war, the state is in a very weak situation. The other than the state mechanism and etc. are those who makes people live and consume and doing things. Even the army has been decomposing during the conflict, and rebuilding the army is now a very important issue in Syria. About Syrian influence in Lebanon, of course, there is a social interaction and a political interaction between Lebanon and Syria for a long time. But Syria is bigger than Lebanon. But the Lebanese has influence in Syria. Nobody talks about that. To make the jokes, many of the Syrians used during the 90s and 2000s to enter Syria, while they didn't have the right because they didn't make their military service or etc., with a pass made by banks, by the security services in Lebanon to enter Syria illegally, to come and out. And I profited myself from that, etc. So Lebanese has influence in Syria from the relation between the power system and the bankers. Is Syria playing a role today in Lebanon? Surely, but this role is much weaker than what has been done, let's say, during the tens of years of presence of the Syrian army in Lebanon, a presence which is a pity, means there was no single common economic project that has been built during this area, which means that this was just profiting from the two power system, profiting from the trade and not building any relation which makes the relation between the two countries viable on the long run. Take the electricity, for example, where Syria could not import a power plant because of pre-2011 sanctions. There was possibility to build a power plant in Lebanon with the Syrian gas, etc., and this was not done. The new Sham project launched between Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. This project by itself is, in my opinion, something to stabilize both Jordan and Iraq. Iraq is in a difficult position. Jordan is in a difficult position. And we have a gap between, let's say, Turkey and Iran, and emerging powers, and the Gulf, which has consistency with the GCC. And those countries are in between all these emerging powers, including Israel. So there is a possibility of structuration of the relation between the three countries. And there is a possibility that this structuration will help both Syria and Lebanon to get out of their problems, their crisis today, like with the agreement between Egypt, Jordan, and Syria and Lebanon to bring gas and electricity. On the question of the regional powers and the regional conflicts, the question of my friend Ramzi, is Syria the key, or is the solution of the regional problems the key? What is impressing is that part of the proxy war inside Syria is a fight between Iran and Turkey. The forces fighting on each side, some of them are pro-Iranian and the others are pro-Turkish or controlled by Turkish. So Turkey and Iran are fighting inside Syria by proxy, while they have very strong economic relations, including taking into account the sanctions of the US sanctions on Iran. Turkey is profiting from the sanctions because it's the only way to get around the sanctions and etc. So is Syria a key? My belief, solving the problem of Syria because of the danger of complete collapse into chaos of the two countries. In Lebanon and Syria, we didn't reach the bottom yet. And the bottom could be worse, in my opinion. So there is a need for something to be done, both at superpowers level, which means the US, Russia, and China, and from Arab countries, at least from the countries who are directly affected, which means Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. How long the Syrian government could survive? The Syrian economy has been decreasing a lot. It is today living with, let's say, something like 60% of the GDP made of international aid and the transfer of migrants. How long this could continue? The transfer of migrants is linked to the policies of the Gulf countries. The international aid is linked with the transfers and the aid of mostly the EU, and it is declining. So this is not sustainable on the long run. Also, the government is using, let's say, his policy in the current negotiations with the northeast of Syria, which is the most plausible negotiation which could happen. This, I don't think that on the long run, let's say in a year or two, the things could go better or could stabilize. They only could get worse, both in Syria and Lebanon. You need, in a country like Syria, which needs irrigation and etc., an organization of the state because of the geography, because of many things, that the state retrieve its functions, and this is not seen on the future. This gives me an argument, just to make it fine, that Syria is a key. The problem, let's say, between Turkey and Iran mainly, is linked with the Kurdish problem and is linked with how Turkey view, with the situation today, the independence of the Kurds or the rule of, let's say, Nusra, Fatah Sham there. Solving this issue could lead to something between Turkey and Iran that could stabilize the region, in my opinion. And this is what the Russians are doing in their meetings about Syria between Russia, Turkey, and Iran. But it's a step-by-step process. And I think there is a new meeting foreseen for the future. And I think that the Americans are following this very, very closely.
Okay, should I take over from here?
Sure.
Okay, let me.
Nasif, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Just let me answer Ramzi's first comment about Lebanon. There is unfortunately, I say unfortunately, a joke that tells a lot about the situation, and that's as such. The Lebanese state is the most neutral state in the world. It doesn't even interfere in its own domestic affairs, basically. Unfortunately, that was the reason. This is why I said every domestic issue has an external component presenting in a domestic fashion, but it reflects these kind of allegiances or alliances built here and there. That's my first comment. My second comment goes to the fact that Syria has always played for some a stabilizing role, a sort of trouble fighter, but for some others it was a troublemaker. If you look at 76, and then if you look at 89, so on and so to speak. But let me look at something also for Syria. Since 2012, 1 year after the explosion of Syria and in Syria, I was making the argument that Syria would need something like Lebanon, which is the following: a sort of external Ta'if before having an internal Ta'if, after the name of the Ta'if city, where the Lebanese parliament finally reached a decision on a new constitution that was adopted in Lebanon. That is the current one. So there must be an understanding among the external actors that are really key power holders in Syria. And the Astana process, Samir mentioned that the Astana, trilateral Astana group represent that matter, but not alone, basically, that alone. And this is how we see, if we move to Syria, that on the Syrian echiquier, on the Syrian chessboard, we see different alliances and different points of confrontations. It's by issue area. If you look at the Southwest, the Russians are taking much into consideration the Israeli interest, strategic interest, security interest in Syria to a very great extent, not being very welcoming to an Iranian presence in Southwest Syria. Northeast, it's Turkey. There will be a competition, as I see coming more and more, how it could be managed between the key two actors, external actors, Russia and Iran in Syria. All these factors make for this competition over this core strategic place called Syria, if I'm looking at the strategic chessboard and the Mashriq. This is very important. Nowadays, what we could see happening, there are three processes that are there. Okay, the nuclear 5+1 negotiation with Iran, it's on and off, but it's moving. It's no more in the situation that it used to be. In the past, each party is trying to negotiate before coming to the table some of the important cards it holds or it wants to hold. The second process, of course, what started in Baghdad in terms of Arab, particularly Saudi-Iranian discussions, and the Syrian, the normalization, the third process, is the different speed of Arab normalization with Syria. But let me go back to Baghdad. Baghdad, 28th of August, the meeting, some would call it a summit, the conference in Baghdad, is ushering a very interesting new opening. It's an uphill struggle, perhaps to something else in the future, to a sort of forum for conflict management, for settling conflict, whatever it is, because all those were enemies or adversaries were there in Baghdad, and the meeting was followed by another meeting in New York, so on and so to speak. It's an uphill struggle, but it is an interesting process that we must be looking at. For Syria's tomorrow, how could it be? It doesn't have to wait until other matters are settled, whether in Yemen or in Iraq or whatever it is. The importance of Syria, it remains in the heart of the conflict over the region because of its geostrategic location for the nth time. It's very important. So it cannot be said, we leave it till after. And this is how I see that there is a development, perhaps indirectly, for some kind of geometry variable, as we say, different approaches, different geometry, to try to see a way on how to stabilize Syria. It's not an easy matter. We are in a grayish zone, but it should be coming. What kind of system? I think we would need an external Ta'if, an understanding against the key power holders before having an internal Syrian Ta'if one day on how to develop a new system. Last but not least, in Lebanon, today, Iran is a key power holder indirectly in Lebanon, more than Syria. Syria still have its friends, some and I might say something that must be astonishing, could be astonishing to somebody, some who are not having very good relations with Syria could prefer a Syrian influence more than an Iranian influence because it's limited to certain areas and not other areas to a certain extent because of the flexibility that Syria has shown in the past. But what Syria is emerging remains the key question, and that's the thing that we must be looking at in the very near future.
Thank you, Nassif and Samir. I'm going to give the floor again to Ramzi if he has another question, but let me actually pose a question to him. Ramzi, if I can ask you, the UN process of trying to deal with the Syrian issue, which seems to be in Geneva off and on, very little notice of what's happening there, if there is anything happening. Is there any real life in that process, or are we going to ultimately have to depend on what both Samir and Nassif mentioned, a geopolitical package to deal with the Syrian issue? I appreciate that will be the case, but I frankly must take issue with what's happening. I just cannot accept that Russia, Turkey, and Iran discuss Syria without Syria being there. I know the Russians can defend some of Syrian interests, but the logic of foreign countries deciding on solutions to Arab problems and Arabs actually supporting that, I just find a bit bizarre. But that's because of the mess that we have in our Arab world itself. But I do agree with both speakers that agreement will have to be reached between more than the Arab participants. It will have to be the nationals in each of these two countries, but also a balance regionally and even one that is a global geopolitical balance. But let me again, just for a quick revert to Ramzi, and then I'll go to the audience that has been sending me questions that I wanted to share. Ramzi?
Yes, Nabil, concerning the UN process, I mean, let's put things into context and let's not overburden the UN with a responsibility that it cannot completely discharge on its own. The UN provides a forum for discussion and negotiations. It also provides, I would say, a framework for settlement, which is reflected in 2254. But it was never, I mean, anyone realistic understands how things operate in the real world, understands that you do need the external actors in Syria, whether be they regional or international, have to come to some sort of understanding that would allow the process, the UN process, to proceed. And the reason why the UN process has not proceeded the way it was originally designed is because of lack of agreement in the region and beyond. Now, the UN process at this point of time, or for the past 2 years, has been reduced to the Constitutional Committee. Now, the Constitutional Committee cannot solve all serious problems. Let's put it this way. It is a forum for discussion. It is one of the mechanisms envisaged in the Security Council Resolution 2254, but on its own, it cannot. So we have to wait for this regional and international understanding that would allow this process to proceed. Now, when we talk about the enabling environment, let me put it this way, that would enable the Syrians to reach a new political understanding or a new social contract, which would be reflected, of course, in a new constitution or an amended constitution, you need to have, in my view, an energized Arab role. And I've been calling for that since I was working on the Syrian file at the UN. Without an Arab role, I find it very difficult for the non-Arab regional powers or for the United States and Russia to give enough interest and enough will to find a settlement. The Arab countries have to present, in my view, an initiative that would mobilize interest internationally. Now, we have seen movements of late. We have seen Jordan presenting ideas, I think very important ideas, in the sense that you need to involve the Syrian government in a more constructive way in the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2254. So it has to be offered incentives, but it also has to take certain measures. And these measures basically are about opening up the political sphere, allowing more freedoms, allowing people to participate in the political system in a more constructive way. Short of that, it's going to be very difficult to see an implementation of 2254. Of course, there's an issue of accountability. There are a lot of other issues, but you have to start someplace. Now, Jordan has been pushing for that. The Iraqis have been also presenting ideas. Let's see how the government in Damascus responds to these things. I think that is critical. If this process moves ahead, it is possible that the Russians and the Americans, who have been discussing Syria off and on for a very long period of time, including about what the future of Syria will look like. I think if there's an Arab initiative on the table, this will force both the United States and Russia to react to it, instead of them discussing the future of Syria behind closed doors. So I think we need to do that, and it needs to be done, in my view, as soon as possible. The overture from Abu Dhabi to Damascus is an interesting development, which should reinforce this. Now, will there be an Arab initiative in one form or the other in the near future? It remains to be seen, but I think this is key to getting the process moving. Let me just ask a question, Nabil, if you allow me, because you did promise that I could ask a question. Samir spoke about a weakened Syrian state. Yes, I agree. I mean, it's not what it was, but it remains a state, and it remains effective in some ways. Maybe not all the good ways, but it is. Now, will a weakened state in Syria make it more possible to have a more decentralized Syria in the future, or not? I mean, Damascus speaks about administrative decentralization. Political decentralization is taboo because, of course, the Kurdish problem, and this may affect others in Syria. As you said, it's a mosaic. So is decentralization now, some sort of decentralization, even if it is a gradual thing? Is it more possible now that the state has been weakened? Or on the contrary, because the state has been weakened, Damascus will become even more intransigent when it comes to decentralization? The other question, and that is also for Samir, but also certainly for Nassif, the two main interventions in Syria, putting aside the Russian, because the Russians have been invited by Damascus, and so has Iran in a way, but of course Iran operates in a different manner. Which is more dangerous for the future of Syria? The Turkish, with its physical presence in the north, attaching northern Syria to the educational system, to the power grid, even the currency and so forth, or the Iranian, which is indirect. The influence of Iran is largely, of course, through its influence over the Syrian government and through, of course, the forces or militias that are on the ground. Which of the two interventions is more serious for the future of Syria as a nation state? Thank you.
Samir and Nassif, you have a number of questions. I'm going to add one, and then for the sake of preserving time, I'm going to summarize for you the number of questions that are coming on the chat, and then allow Samir and Nassif to respond to them collectively. My question, frankly, and my comment, I also followed the recent overtures by Emirates to Syria, and I've been calling for overtures to Syria for over a year now, including Syria being able to return to the Arab League without undue delay. But frankly, while I don't really believe in boycotting Syria, I don't think that serves anything, I'm interested also in your opinions as to what can the Syrians actually offer as a counter initiative, as a counter offer, if there is another Arab effort to engage the Syrians. What steps can Syria actually take to respond to them? It can't be an all or nothing process, especially if we want to rebalance the Syrian and the Lebanese package, so it's not completely distorted in favor of the non-Arabs. Again, I know this is not fair to our two initial speakers, but let me also share with you a couple of the comments that, for some reason, a lot of the comments have been erased, but Dr. Atiyah, again, a comment was raised about the economic viability of Syria. To Nassif, another comment was raised about, well, given that elections will occur in Lebanon during the next year, are there new leaders, emerging new leaders, given that the present ones seem to be entrenched in old modalities? A third question to Samir was, we all talk about social contracts, but is a social contract in Syria, excuse me, something one can expect? Or is the domestic situation so difficult and has been so traumatic that at this point, a social contract is not a real feasible option? And two final questions, either of you can deal with them. The role of Israel in all of this process, be that in Lebanon or Syria, and last but not least, is there an American role in either of them, and what is it? I will leave the remaining 10 minutes that we have to Samir and Nassif to take as much time as you want. And of course, Ramzi, if you want to engage again in it, just raise your hand or message me and I'll give you the floor as well. Samir and Nassif, any one of you want to start?
Yeah, let me perhaps make also a few remarks here. First and foremost, about the elections in Lebanon. Optimistic figures would say that there will be like 10, 12, perhaps 15 new parliamentarians elected from representing the civil society. It's a good beginning. It's not going to change the system, definitely. What's going to create conditions for a major change in the system, and I don't know if this is for tomorrow, the system will keep resisting any kind of serious change, of structural, comprehensive change, is the drastic situation. The fact that we are imploding, the country is imploding entirely with very dangerous impact even on security that could be felt, I hope not, as we say, tomorrow, from economic to social to all kinds of problems, the implosion of Lebanon. So this is what I say is the objective condition that might force the hands to accept some major changes. But the elections definitely will not make the change as it is expected. And we're going to go into that very, very soon. For the role, what comes first, Iran or Turkey in terms of external influence, vis-a-vis Arab influence? I always argued about the need of Arab engagement, conditional, call it conditional engagement, but to throw a certain weight to balance the Iranian role on one hand with the government of Syria, and also to balance the Turkish presence in certain areas in northern Syria. That's a very important matter. Otherwise, if you leave Syria open, leave a sort of dis-Arabization, what I argued for years now, Nabil, about the dis-Arabization of the Arab region order. It has been dis-Arabized, opening and inviting returning power with a sort of imperial appetite, which have a sort of legacy, a sort of history, especially coming under all forms of Islamism in the region. With the disappearance, this is another issue of any kind of Arabism, attractive Arabism, so to speak, which render that more possible. Power projection plus ideological attractiveness a la carte, as we say. But there is a strong need for an Arab, call it conditional, gradual re-engagement in Syria to create a sort of balancing role, because it's very important not only for Syria, it's important for Lebanon, it's important for Iraq, it's important for the Levant, for the Mashriq itself, which is a very strategic area in terms of its presence in the Arab world. This is something extremely important that we have to look at. How much change could happen tomorrow in Syria? I think we also, thinking loudly, we might go to a new regime, as I mentioned, not necessarily like some would call for. I'm not saying here, I'm not passing a judgment. I'm saying perhaps a more, representative, more inclusive regime. Many ideas were presented. You remember in years back, at the beginning of the Astana process, the Russians have presented, so to speak, a non-paper on how to decentralize a bit politically, not only in terms of geographic, administrative matters, the regime, would it be accepted or not, depending on the balance of power, but to have a more inclusive in terms of representativeness for the regimes. These are all issues on the table. For the Israeli role, for Israel, it seems what's interesting, the peace issue is no more at the table. It's not no more on the radar, not only with Syria and the region, for reasons beyond our discussion today. But of course, it could not allow making peace, but could not force peace in the region its own way. But this will remain a key issue. And the modus operandi that was functional since 1974, since the disengagement in the Golan Heights in 1974, the agreement on disengagement, will remain, as we could see today, that the Syrian government is not opposed to that. We don't see opposite to what Russia is doing in southwest Syria, which has support of Americans and of others. That's a key point that you must take into consideration. I end up perhaps by a comment, and will be more than happy to answer if any point is raised about it. At one point of time, there must be a sine qua non condition, like for Lebanon, a sort of understanding among wider group, more inclusive group of power holders in Syria, and not leaving only to non-Arab actors. But this is here a challenge to Arabs to assume this role. Hope I didn't abuse of my time. Leave it to Samir.
No,
not to abuse, to finish.
Yes, I will start where you ended, Nassif, on the external issues, and specifically first on the Arab role. Realistically, I don't believe that an Arab role in general, which means from Morocco to Yemen, etc., could be relevant. The Arab countries today, in themselves, they have problems of choices and different choices. Take Qatar and the UAE, they have different agendas. So to get UAE and Qatar together in the same initiative, it's a very complex thing. I think that the major role has to be taken by the Arab countries, which are the most interested in the solution in Syria and Lebanon, which are precisely Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. So supported by other Arab countries who wanted to play the role to support this. But the initiative could not be Arab in the general sense, but more a Mashriq Arabi initiative. To be realistic, to have something to go. And this goes with what Jordan is saying, what Kazemi in Iraq is saying and what the Egyptians are saying, but waiting to play a role in. On the question of which are the worst, the Turkish or the Iranians, when we first made, as an opposition, some kind of social contract or project for social contract, in the first opposition meeting held in Damascus in 2011, we wrote as an opposition as that the Syria has to be at equal distance with Turkey and with Iran. We share with these both countries history. They are Islamists like us. And if someone asked a question about the same question on Iraq, he will have a difficult answer because today the Turkish economy controls most of the Iraqi economy, and the other part is controlled by the Iranians. Means the founding elements of the Iraqi economy besides oil has been completely collapsing. Iraq import everything from Turkey or Iran and needs Iran to refine its oil. The Syrian situation is a little bit better, but let's say the revival of Syria cannot be made without taking into account that some of the Syrian investors went to Turkey and created economic relations with Turkey. So there is a deal to make with Turkey, that there is relations with Iraq and Iran consequently. So Syria has to deal with both countries in a proper manner, in a reasonable manner. By the way, also the Syrian industrialists has been investing in Egypt. So there is a link today very strong between, let's say, the Syrian industry and the Egyptian industry on the long run. So the deal is to be made with Turkey and Iran, etc. On the role of Israel, Israel by essence is the contrary of Syria and Lebanon, of a project of Syria, Lebanon as a country for all its citizens, despite their religious behavior or etc. Israel is one religion and all other religions are second category of citizens. This cannot be the case for Lebanon. This could not be the case for Syria. The Gulf countries cannot see this in the same way as vital. For different reasons, the US is following Israel positions for a long time. The Russians, a little bit less. And somehow, not because somebody likes Russia more than the US, but somehow one could be happy that the Russians deal with the Israelis to condemn and not the weakened Lebanon and the weakened Syria today. This, if played in a proper way, could lead to somehow limit the influence of Israel. One of the most interesting things that is happening these days is how Jordan, to launch its initiative, not only get the green light from the US, but the King of Jordan went to Russia and get the green light also and discuss the project with Mr. Putin. This on the external side. On the social contract, let's say first, what is internally to be negotiated inside Syria? There is a negotiation between, let's say, the whole of the regions controlled by the government and the Northeast on the basis of what is the Kurdish situation and how to retrieve a solution which could be acceptable by the Kurds and acceptable by all Syrians. And the key element here is what has been mentioned on decentralization. The other negotiation is to be made with the northwest of Syria. And this negotiation is in fact a yes negotiation with Turkey, the no negotiation with Nusra. I don't know myself, maybe some other people could have other opinions. If there is a negotiation, a political solution with Nusra to retrieve, let's say, the unity between Idlib and the rest of Syria, the negotiation has to be made with Turkey. And if there is a deal with Turkey, the solution could be implemented. And I talked about Astana and etc. for that. And on the subject of decentralization, there are different things. This is a theme that is thrown in the negotiations and etc. And everybody interpreted in a different way. Few comments. One, you cannot make decentralization if the central government is weak and ineffective. Decentralization is a balance of power between a good center, a good governance center, and a good governance on the local level. Today, we don't have good governance on the local level, despite the court elections made in the Northeast and the Northwest. And we don't have a good governance on the central level. This is a problem. The second is that the second issue is when you talk about decentralization, you need to implement some good rules of decentralization at the city level, say, but also at some regional level inside. And the question is what region? If you take the Northwest, the Northeast as, let's say, a geography, this geography is complex. It's 3 Syrian governorates. The Kurds are represented massively in the completely north, in Hasaki, the Muhafaza governorate, but not really in the resort and not really in Raqqa. So the question is, what is the decentralization and how you regulate the relation between the level of a city, the level of a governorate, and the level of the central government. What was, in my opinion, stupid is that at some point in Syria, the decision to make a small, not hospital, but even a healthcare center in a small village had to be decided by the minister in Damascus, which has no meaning. This is a local decision, and all these thing of decentralization has to be thought, discussed, and etc. to achieve, let's say, easing that the people are having representation locally and having the tools to negotiate at the different levels with the central government. Is Syria economically viable today? It has declined a lot. The process of the economic process has been really impeded both by sanctions and by the policy of the government, especially in the last few months because of the elections, the new elections of Bashar al-Assad, who wanted to stabilize the currency from the fall with the Lebanese currency, but this at the expense of killing the economy inside Syria. This is not sustainable. But could Syria be viable? Of course it can be viable, but it depends what you will do with Syria. What is reconstruction of Syria or the reborn of Syria? Is it selling assets at cheap prices to foreign countries or foreign investors, or is it reactivating Syrian investment in Syria first, like you can pose the same problem in Lebanon, reactivating Lebanese investment in Lebanon first, to have other investors, international investors coming. Nobody sells in times of crisis, because in times of crisis you sell at cheap price. On the last comment is, my belief is also that we didn't reach the bottom in Lebanon today. Syria could be stabilized because of this powerful central power. But Lebanon, there are risks. And my biggest concern is that you have 1/3 of the Lebanese population, which is made of Syrian refugees. And if you hear the news about what's happening and who shooted in the different sectarian conflicts lately, everybody accused that Syrians shooted on this side or this side. Syrians in Lebanon are today the biggest community in the country, the biggest community in Lebanon. So they could be the tool of a new civil war between Syrians for the accounts of different Lebanese communities and for the account of different powers. This is a fear that I really have on the future. And this could reignite the Syrian conflict in a different way.
Thank you, Samir, very much. I don't want to go too long. We've gone beyond the hour and 15 minutes that we originally scheduled. All three of you have really brought in a lot of detail to the Syrian and Lebanese situations. You've all highlighted the complexity of both the problems there and the solutions. But at the same time, I think you've, without exception, underlined the importance of starting to address them, be that domestically or be that regionally and internationally. I think this discussion was very insightful. I don't think we provided the audience with solutions, but I don't frankly believe that that is possible simply in a Zoom debate. But your insights really were extremely useful to think the process through. And hopefully over the next couple of months, there will be a larger Arab engagement, be that from intellectuals, businessmen, or politicians, to really try to address both of these issues, but to really try to engage in a stronger role on both of these theaters, because they're not going to be resolved in a month or two to come. And I very much agree, although I want to disagree with Samir, that I think things will get worse before they get better on this situation. I also want to take this occasion to underline that unless Arabs re-engage on their issues, they will only have themselves to blame as they look towards the future, because the regional players or the geopolitical or the global ones are not taking them seriously. The only way to move forward is to take action, be that action on the ground, which is not really feasible, or be that the action of ideas, which is something that Ramzi had mentioned, also by trying to put forward proposals. And let me close by saying I hope that this will involve engaging the Syrians and in waking up the Lebanese, if I may say, because this is really a sorry story. But I also want to say that I really hope that the Syrians don't over-negotiate their engagement and understand that it's important for them also to move towards the Arab center. Thank you all three for your interventions. We had a very good audience throughout this session. And we hope to have you and others on future Zooms as we continue to debate global and public affairs here at the American University in Cairo. Thank you and good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shukran jazeelan.
Shukran. Thank you, guys. Thank you, dear friends.
Thank you.